Hello. Welcome back to the study of Following Jesus, Discipleship in the Gospel of Mark. As we are studying this book, we are in reality studying the Gospel of Mark, identifying its unique message. In the first two studies that we have shared, I've suggested to you that the unique message of the Gospel of Mark is discipleship. The Gospel, in telling the story of Jesus, also tells the story of the disciples. It reflects their spiritual journey from being blind to seeing but not clearly, to ultimately seeing clearly. In the first half of the Gospel, in the first 8 chapters of Mark, the disciples do not recognize Jesus as the Messiah, nor do they understand the things that Jesus was teaching. They were blind. In our last session, we looked at the thinking that blocked their ability to understand what Jesus was saying. The gospel writer uses the phrase, the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, to describe that kind of thinking. It's the kind of thinking that permeates all of our world. It is a merit-based thinking that focuses upon rules and laws and standards of expectations to which we are to measure up. It is a way of thinking that engages in rigid right and wrong, black and white thinking that emphasizes that we obey the law and conform to the social expectations. This kind of thinking divides us into us-them categories in which we compare and compete with one another and looking at the other as less than and thinking of ourselves as better than. And that creates a hierarchy in which we use power in the hierarchy against those below us. And this way of thinking fosters what is called a constructed self, an ego-based self. Now this is the way the disciples inherently thought. It was how they had been trained to think. It is how they had been trained to function in the world, and that blocked their ability to hear what Jesus had to say. Part of that kind of thinking is that it divides us into categories of us and them. And in today's study, we're going to look at how the disciples lived out of that us-them mentality. We're going to look at 3 stories that the biblical writer strung together, all of which took place in Gentile territory. You'll find these stories in chapter 7 and chapter 8. These 3 stories are set up by a conflict that Jesus had, recorded in the beginning of chapter 7, with the religious leaders. The religious leaders were complaining that Jesus and his disciples violated the religious traditions. The reason? They failed to eat with ceremonially cleansed or washed hands. Jesus responded to their complaint in 2 ways. The first thing he said was that the religious leaders, by following their traditions, actually ignored and set aside and thereby violated the teachings of God. And then he said, the real issue here is the heart, the interior. Listen what he says as he quotes from Isaiah. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. After the interaction with the religious leaders, Jesus then turned to the crowd in order to teach the crowd, to use this as a teachable moment, to help the crowd understand and begin to think in a different way. This is what he says to the crowd in Mark chapter 7, verse 14. Then Jesus called the crowd again and said to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. In this, Jesus is seeking to get the people to shift their thinking from a focus upon the outside, that is behavior, what a person does and doesn't do, to the inside, from the exterior to the external to the internal, from behavior to the heart. It's one of the major teachings of Jesus. It's one of the major focus of the kingdom of God. But yet, religious people seem stuck in focusing upon behavior while ignoring the internal condition of the heart, the spirit and the attitudes out of which they live. When Jesus got together with his disciples after that teaching, the disciples asked him about it. Verse 17, now when Jesus had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, then do you also fail to understand? Again, this repeated theme in the first half of the Gospel of Mark, that the disciples could not understand the things that Jesus taught about the kingdom of God and about God. Verse 18b, do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart but the stomach and goes out into the sewer? Jesus said it's not a matter of what we eat. Then the biblical writer puts a parenthesis. Thus Jesus declared all foods clean. Jesus basically said, it doesn't matter what you eat. The issue of kosher is no longer a factor. The question is, what else did Jesus declare clean? You see, the unclean designation was a major emphasis in the religious culture of that day. It was that which determined who was acceptable and who was not. If you followed the scribal interpretations of the law, then you lived a life that was considered clean, and thus you were welcomed in the temple to worship. But if you failed to live up to those scribal interpretations, then you were considered unclean and you were rejected. And Jesus rejected that entire way of thinking because he didn't focus upon the behavior, he focused upon the heart, the interior realm. Jesus went on to say, it is what comes out of a person that defiles, for it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. And then Jesus listed all of these behaviors that are described as, that are labeled as sin, including some that are reflected in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. Fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. Jesus in this teaching is saying that the problem in human life is what is in the heart. It is the interior realm that needs to be our focus, for it is the spirit out of which we live and the attitudes with which we live that put us out of step with God. Following that teaching, the biblical writer then records 3 stories that took place in Gentile territory. Jesus left the area of Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, and then went over to the coast of the Mediterranean to Gentile territory. Now, this order is intentional. It is as though Jesus wants to drive home the truth that he has just taught. Jesus wants the disciples to understand not just the truth, but the implications of it. It's as though the teachings in the first part of chapter 7 were the classroom. What he does now in Gentile territory is the lab. And the lab work was designed to reinforce and drive home the teachings of the classroom. The first of those stories is found in verse 24. From there Jesus sent out and went away to the region of Tyre. That is on the Mediterranean coast, north and west of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus entered the house and did not want anyone to know he was there, and yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. The biblical writer does not want us to miss the fact that this woman was a Gentile. The woman's daughter was possessed of a demon. She begged Jesus to heal her daughter. But Jesus said to her, Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Well, that's not the kind of response that we're accustomed to hearing from Jesus. The story, as recorded in Matthew, says that the woman was repeatedly begging Jesus, and he ignored her. And the disciples came and said, "Send her away. She's bothering us." How are we to understand this seemingly uncharacteristic response from Jesus to this Gentile woman? Well, the cue to that is found, number one, in how the disciples thought about the Gentiles, and number two, in how he spoke to her. You see that all Jews, which would have included the disciples, viewed the Gentiles as unclean. They commonly referred to Gentiles as dogs. So what Jesus was doing was mirroring how the disciples thought about and how the disciples would treat a Gentile woman. But what is interesting is the language Jesus used. He used a metaphor and said, it's not right to take the food from the children off of the table and feed the dogs. And the word dog that Jesus used was a special word. There are two primary words in the Greek for dog. One word is that of a street dog, a common cur. The second was a lap dog, a family pet. How many of you who have house dogs, family pets, don't feed the dog sometimes from the table? That's what Jesus was saying. Jesus said it's not right to take the food off the table, which belongs to the family, to the children, that is to the people of Israel, and feed it to the family pet. And the woman came back, but, "Oh, yes, Lord, but even the family pet eats the crumbs that fall on the floor." There must have been a twinkle in his eye. There must have been a tone in his voice that invited the woman to respond back. And when the woman responded back, Jesus said, "For saying that, you may go, for the demon has left your daughter." And so she went home and found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. The woman said, "Yes, Lord, but even the family pet eats the crumbs that fall from the table." In other words, the family pet does eat the food from the table. And in doing so, she was saying the blessings of the kingdom are not reserved just for the Jewish people. At least we Gentiles could have the crumbs. And Jesus granted her the food from the table. In other words, he granted her healing for her daughter, what had been reserved for seemingly the Jewish people in the kingdom. That story is followed then immediately by the story of healing. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went down by Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. Now the Decapolis, the phrase Decapolis means 10 cities. And so the Decapolis was the region to the east of the River Jordan and east of the Sea of Galilee, again Gentile territory. And they brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech. And they begged Jesus to lay his hand on the man. So Jesus took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and he put his fingers in his ears. Jesus spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more that he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it, and they were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." Now this is seemingly simply another healing miracle in which Jesus heals a deaf man, and by healing his deafness enables him not just to hear clearly, but to speak clearly. But I want to suggest to you that the deaf man is a metaphor for the disciples. Just as the blind man in chapter 8 that we've already looked at was a metaphor for the disciples. They needed to not have their eyes touched so that they could see, move from blindness to seeing clearly, seeing but not clearly, to a second touch which enabled them to see more clearly. Now here, the deaf man is also a metaphor for the disciples. Why? Because they could not hear. They could not hear the things that Jesus was teaching about the ways of God and the kingdom of God. And if they couldn't hear it, they couldn't speak clearly about the kingdom as he sent them forth. He needed them to hear clearly what he was teaching about the truths of the kingdom, so that then they could proclaim clearly what those truths were. The third story is found in the beginning of chapter 8. In those days, when there was again a great crowd without anything to eat, Jesus called his disciples and said to them, I have compassion for the crowd, because they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. And his disciples replied, How can one feed these people with bread here in the desert? Jesus asked them, So how many loaves do you have? And they answered, 7. Then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute. And they distributed them to the crowd. They ate and were filled, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. Now there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. And immediately he got into a boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanuthia. Now I'm sure that this story sounds very familiar, because it is almost identical to a story that the gospel writer recorded back over in chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000. The two stories are different in 2 primary ways. On the surface, they're different in the number of people. 5,000, 4,000. The number of loaves, 5 loaves, 7 loaves. The number of leftovers picked up, 12 baskets, 7 baskets. But the primary difference is found in the very opening. That the crowd had been there without anything to eat, and Jesus says, I have compassion for the crowd because they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. In the story of the feeding of the 5,000, the disciples came to Jesus at the end of the first day and urged Jesus to send the crowd away because they were going to be hungry and there was nothing to feed them. Here, in this story, in chapter 8, 3 days had gone by, and the disciples had said nothing about sending the crowd away, nothing about the crowd being hungry. That raises the question, why? Why had not the disciples, after 3 days, raised the issue of feeding the crowd? After all, they'd been a part of Jesus feeding the 5,000 just days or weeks before. The answer to the question why is very simple. The crowd that is recorded in chapter 8 is a Gentile crowd. And the disciples' concern for the 5,000 was because they were Jews. But because these people were Gentiles, the disciples had no compassion for them. And Jesus begins by saying, I have compassion for these people. In these 2 great stories, the biblical writer addresses thinking that is inherent to how we humans naturally function. It is thinking that is inherent to the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. In the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus addressed the issue of scarcity. Jesus said to them, you feed them. And the disciples said, how can we? We only have 5 loaves, 2 fishes. What we have is not adequate. And yet Jesus took what was not adequate blessed it, broke it, and distributed it. And it was not only adequate to feed the crowd, but they had 12 baskets left over. Jesus was teaching that in the kingdom of God, there's always more than enough. The 12 baskets in the feeding of the 5,000 corresponds to the 12 tribes of Israel. In the kingdom of God, there's always enough for all of God's people. But in the feeding of the 4,000, the disciples took up 7 baskets, which raises the question, what's the significance of the 7? If the 12 represented the 12 tribes of Israel, what did the 7 represent? We find the answer to that question in Hebrew history. In the story of when Joshua led the people of Israel out of the wilderness into the promised land to claim the promised land. When Joshua led the people into the land of promise, there were already people living there. So Joshua and the people of Israel had to displace the people who were there. Gentile people. There were 7 different people groups, 7 different Gentile nations living in the land of promise when Joshua led the people in. And so this feeding of the 4,000 and the collecting of 7 baskets left over proclaims the great truth that there's more than enough for all of God's people in the kingdom, whether they be Jew or Gentile. In the feeding of the 5,000, the biblical writer addresses that thinking of scarcity by saying, no, that in the kingdom there's more than enough. In the feeding of the 4,000, the biblical writer addresses that way of thinking in which we divide people into us and them categories, Jew and Gentile. And he says that in the kingdom of God, there is no us them, for all are beloved children of God, and there's more than enough for all of God's children. The Gentile stories were the lab in which Jesus sought to drive home the truth that he had proclaimed in the classroom. The issue is not the external. The issue is what's in the heart. What is the attitude? What is the spirit with which we look at other people? So as we come to the end of this session, I invite you to do some reflecting. If you're in a small group, to do some discussing. So how do you see the thinking, the leaven of the Pharisees, the leaven of Herod? How do you see that kind of thinking reflected in the behavior of the disciples? Where do you see in your own experience this kind of us-them thinking? Who is it that is other, is them, is less than in your world? Where does scarcity thinking versus abundance come in? And what does that say about your heart? For Jesus said the important thing is the interior realm, the heart, for that's where the problem lies. In our next session, we'll move out of this first half of the gospel into the second half, from when the disciples are blind to when they are able to see, but just not clearly. And in that section, we'll look at the heart of Jesus' teaching about discipleship. In our next session, we'll look at chapters 8, 9, and 10. Until then, the peace of Christ be with you.